It is 6 o'clock. We will call the special meeting of the December 3rd, 2020 of the Trinity County Planning Commission to order. First off, we will have public comment period. This is for public comment on items that are not on tonight's agenda that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. Would anyone like to address the Planning Commission in the initial public comment period? All right, seeing none, we will close the public comment period and move on to agenda item number 1.
Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. It's good to be back for this continued meeting from November 19th regarding the EIR and Commercial Cannabis Ordinance. So we have, I do want to point out just as I begin, is that we, again, this evening have our consultant, Mr. Pat Angel, available to help answer any questions that may arise, add some clarification if needed. And I believe, although I don't see at the moment, that we also have our counsel, Derek Cole, just as last meeting to help fill in where required. So as a continuation of the last meeting, I'm not looking to go into any great depth. No PowerPoints, no presentations really at any length. You have the staff packet in front of you, which I want to remind for the public was made available on the website yesterday at the end of the day per requirements for notification. So as we go forward with this, I just want to reiterate and make sure that we're all on the same page, we're all looking at the same thing, and that is the staff report that is included on the website and provided. So along those lines, I need my notes. Apologies. So what we're doing here now, just to sort of recap and enunciate why we're here, a continued meeting, of course. The principal request from staff is to adopt a resolution that does two things. It recommends to the board certification and adoptions of findings for the EIR itself per CEQA requirements, as a commission you're well aware of. Also, it is recommending to the board adopting the Commercial Cannabis Ordinance that is also presented in your packet in the staff report. To highlight that one particular point, that ordinance has been amended only slightly. And so again, I'm trying to stress that that is the ordinance that we're looking at that is in your packet at the moment. So with that resolution that has been provided to you, that is where staff is hoping to get tonight. That being said, with the conversation and the discussion that occurred during the last meeting, you had requested that we provide or bring some language, some potential changes that could be included in that recommendation to the board. And so that is also in your staff packet. It is the second section. It essentially is attachment A. And in trying to line this out for means of discussion, it's actually attachment 1, I believe. But so I don't get lost. It's actually just the staff report itself. Forgive me. So the idea there is I was trying to line out what was discussed. And there were maybe 7 mitigations that were specifically brought up by the commissioners for discussion. Of those, there was some concerns, say, if that's the word, that were raised. There were some suggested changes to those mitigation measures, but only some of them. For staff, it was a little bit tricky, honestly, based on how the commission was functioning that night to understand if you're really proposing a change or not, but we tried to understand where you're coming from. Along those lines, some changes were suggested and rationale provided for some of those mitigations, but not all of them. And so that, again, is where we can discuss tonight, what we felt as staff we can add to the resolution and what maybe we should not. So that can be brought up at your pleasure. where the options that I would say that you have here tonight, again, is the first option perhaps is the recommendation from staff, again, is that you get to the point of adopting a resolution tonight so that this item would then be agendized for the board, and then that would proceed with the process for secret compliance and for the cannabis ordinance itself. One option in front of you as well, though, is to make further changes, and those would be changes to the resolution in the amendment A, or attachment A of the resolution, that then those recommended changes would be discussed in front of the board. Another idea is that because staff is a little bit wary about the idea of capturing specific language provided by the commission, that we're not looking to make, say, line item changes of any great detail, because there's a chance for something to get lost. And in my opinion, specifically, it's not a good, concise way to create an ordinance or to add language to something. So another option for your consideration later is that this commission could actually recommend and vote on the idea that the chair could actually have authority, delegate authority to the chair to approve any changes that you may wish to see. What that would look like is that you would pass the resolution, delegate authority to the chair, that when that resolution is actually signed by the chair, that a review of those amendments, he would have an opportunity to review those and approve those amendments to capture the will of the commission. So that's one option. And of course, this option of proceeding or continuing the meeting, which as discussed during the last meeting is not desirable by staff or even to the advice of Council Cole. That is not something that we would recommend at that time or this time. So I hope that's fairly clear in that what we're doing, one, trying to get to a resolution, discussing those items that are of interest to you, both that were discussed in the last meeting or any potential other items that you would like to raise, and working out a method for actually addressing those. We tried to capture what you had suggested. If you need changes, then okay, we can figure out how to do that. But at that moment, I'd like to invite either Pat Angel or Derek Cole to fill in any gaps before I hand it over. And if there are no suggestions, that is fine too.
Good evening, Commissioners. I don't have anything to add. I think David has done an excellent job of outlining the actions for the Commission to take. So I'm certainly happy to answer any questions or provide any guidance that the Commission may need, but David has outlined things very well.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions for staff?
Well, I think one of the key issues is how some of these mitigation measures will actually be implemented. And some of the more complicated ones, as we talked about, like groundwater monitoring or odor. I mean, odor requires a plan, so that actually, but groundwater monitoring, there's a lot of detail that needs to be included so that applicants and neighbors know what to expect or what the, I see some of these as requiring almost like a implementation plan for how the applicants are to go about collecting the data that are required. And that's going to take a fair amount of time to do. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I do off the top of my head, yes. And I recall from the last meeting, of course, that was an area of particular interest, and rightfully so, because it is one that many jurisdictions have had trouble trying to deal with. We are dealing with groundwater, as you well know. It's a myriad of different ways that can play out in the landscape. This particular mitigation measure, it describes the impact, and it describes the mitigation itself. But to the point that the mitigation may not be as detailed, say, at the level of a plan, I can understand that. But typically for this type of document or that type of mitigation, you would not go into that great of a detail other than suggesting that is an impact. In order to mitigate it, you're going to have some adaptive management, some method to address it. It has the bare bones of the method that is described in the data monitoring and ground level water monitoring. Those on their own right are not, say, technically difficult to do, I would argue. The idea of groundwater level monitoring within any particular well, or the data of usage coming from that well. Those are technologies that are available and are fairly common, I would say. If you were starting to get into the idea of pump testing, for example, which is a much more, say, intensive sort of one-time test of the productivity of a well, that becomes another step up, in my opinion, in terms of complexity. But how the mitigation is written is one where we considered it to be feasible, that would provide data to the county that would indicate if a particular problem existed at a particular well. Of course, if there's no real indication of a problem to begin with, then that monitoring is not as intensive. But if it did get to the level of, we feel there is a problem here because of the data that is provided, that's where an adaptive management plan would have to come into play. And that could take a whole number of different routes, of course, it's adaptive, but based off of the site considerations. So this is not the place to get into that level of kind of breaking down exactly what that plan would look like. It's trying to speak to and provide the county an opportunity to address an identified impact. Later on, when you get into the idea of mitigation monitoring, reporting program or plan, you know, that's who's sort of doing what. That's one way to, again, take the next step of who's actually dealing with the mitigation itself. But I would argue that, you know, the transition for implementing this EIR, of course, we recognize that that is going to be a process in its own right. We have discussed that recently in several public venues. The idea of a transition plan, we recognize is something that is needed. This could, well, the actual details of this particular mitigation and others could be described within that transition plan for how this will actually be implemented. But I would argue it's too early to bring that up in this particular venue and under the purview of this commission. I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. There's way too much detail, but at some point there will need to be more detail.
I agree.
On some of these items.
Agreed.
So Diana said it should be.
Go ahead, Diana.
Regarding that, I'm concerned about that as well, and I know that we discussed this at the last meeting, and I was surprised not to see it at least mentioned on the list that of recommendations that was going to the Board of Supervisors, at least as an area where we had some concerns.
Apologies, I didn't hear the first component. Are you speaking to the same mitigation just discussed?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I'm speaking to the same mitigation, and as I said, I was surprised because I thought that the items that we saw of concern would all be, if not have an answer, be listed on that, on the document that goes to the Board of Supervisors as areas that we do have concerns and for them to look at more, perhaps more closely.
Okay, I understand the question now. Thank you, Commissioner Stewart. So when I was putting together specifically, and this is for the public or otherwise to look at what we're talking about, this is in the staff report. And this is, so within the first, I believe, 5 pages of that staff report, we are looking at the 5th page for mitigation, number 6, mitigation measure 3.10-2. And so my interpretation of what happened or what occurred in the last meeting was that, yes, these items were discussed as areas of interest to the commission. And we took notes on it, we reviewed the video, we tried to understand and interpret what was being discussed. My opinion for that particular matter being discussed was the idea of groundwater and surface water connectivity, monitoring plans, how groundwater can actually be monitored effectively. It was, in my view, a discussion. And so that because there was no, say, specific change that was suggested by the commission at that time, I did not include it into the resolution attachment A. So I understand that perhaps I misinterpreted, say, your opinion, Commissioner Stewart, about how this should have been laid out. I understand that, but to highlight that particular item, it was one that was discussed. No change was really suggested. So if it was the commission's will to add some other language to attachment A that would simply say these are areas of concern, that is something that we could easily do.
I heard that, and this would be one that I would like the Board of Supervisors to look at carefully. I'm sure they'll look at them all carefully, but this is one especially. And there is another, and that is odor, and especially within odor, the section where it refers to early harvesting and under what conditions that basically abatement would occur, because that of course would completely eliminate perhaps a whole year's worth of income from the person who has that farm. And so it seems that there would have to be some more detail in that area to make it even feasible. And that is that I think should be listed as being of concern.
To speak to that now, and for those listening, this is mitigation measure 3.3-3 of the executive summary of volume 2 of the final EIR. And that impact, just to cover some bases, is listed as significant, and after mitigation is applied, it's significant and unavoidable, and that is specifically for odor control, or the exposure of people to objectionable odors. So that is where we are now. Okay, so I'm hearing two things. One, the first is that, yes, you want to bring this up as an issue of concern. I admit that was discussed during the last meeting, but it did not make it to where we are now, and so it's absolutely appropriate to bring it up again. A second point to make is that there were some significant changes made to that mitigation between the draft EIR and the final EIR, and that was coming from the number of public meetings that were held in a variety of formats and forums while we were in the draft EIR process. So there are a number of changes to that, and so I'm trying to pull out exactly what you're speaking to, which is the idea of immediate harvest. So that is, I believe, the last bullet point.
It is.
It is the third sub-bullet point, I think is one way to put it. So I hear what you're saying, or you're suggesting that is perhaps too onerous, that is too impactful of mitigation, if I am paraphrasing you correctly. And I understand, and it's not lost on staff that is a fairly heavy mitigation component. But I would argue, and I would also invite Mr. Angel or Cole to speak to it if they wish, or Senior Planner DeRose if she wishes, that still can be on the table given some extreme circumstances. But I would consider that personally to be an extreme method in order to reach a mitigation solution. One way to read any of these mitigations, specifically within the executive summary, is that the impact is listed, and then you have a number of different bullet points. One way to read this, and I believe how it's intended, is that you go from top to bottom. And so to point that out is that is one of the last bullet points, or the last bullet point. And so it's intended as not what you would first consider doing by any means. Every other method to address it, some management plan, some adaptive management in terms of anything else suggested there should be, and I would say would be considered first, that is how this was intended to be read as it was written in that way. So the 2 points there. One, it's good suggestion that this should be a topic of conversation, of course, in terms of that particular element. Leave it at the will of the commission to decide whether it requires further discussion or whether it requires further language modification.
And this is Pat again from a sense. That language, and let me just be clear about this point, it's a series of bullets that identify possible ways to address odor. And please note the language says may include immediate and complete harvest of cannabis plants. It doesn't say will require. So it's one of typical methods that could be employed. What we try to do here is provide suggestions, but not necessarily box in a cannabis cultivator on ways they may be able to address odor. We simply want to address the nuisance issue, but I personally don't want, the intent is not to dictate one way has to be done and no other way. There may be multiple options as time goes on, and there may be additional strains of cannabis that come out that maybe are work well in the marketplace and have a benefit of reducing odors. At this point, we simply want to have a performance standard that addresses the issue. But certainly, I understand the concern, and if that was a possible option that the commission did not feel was appropriate, it certainly could be removed. And mitigation, that the intent of performance standards of mitigation still stands.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how the rest of the commissioners feel about this, but and it's something that we did talk about at the last meeting, the fact that you can't always tell where odor is coming from. The odor may be not coming from the grow that's down the street from you. It may be coming from your next door neighbor's 6 plants that are, practically right on your fence, and that you may not know are there. And I just would hate to see anybody decide that this is something that that was okay to do just without really thinking twice about it.
Go ahead.
Addressing that? I fully agree with what Commissioner Stewart has to say regarding the smell. I mean, it's one thing that, as a farmer, they pay the money for the fines, they jump through all the hoops, they're invested in this crop, they have X amount of money invested in it, and 3 weeks before harvest, a month before harvest, a neighbor says it stinks. And that option being there lends the farmers to think that there's a possibility where they could lose their crops. So there's a level of uncertainty with this mitigation that they say, well, that is the lowest of the bullet points, but that is still a mitigation that someone who is following all the rules, but because their smell is offensive to a neighbor, then they could take away their investment, their business for that whole entire year. It seems like that is, it's unfeasible for a farmer to bounce back from just losing their whole entire harvest for the year. And that seems like that mitigation is impractical. Maybe to have it be such where by the next year there would have to be some type of changes or mitigations put in place that would absolutely have to change. But it is, to cut down somebody's harvest is draconian. And so I think that it needs to be complete, that portion of it should not be, unless it's an illegal garden, of course, but a legal garden where they have everything dialed except for that seems that should not be an option. In my opinion. Any other commissioners have any insights on that?
I completely agree that eradicating the current harvest is inappropriate. So I think that the references to the current harvest should be stricken, and you can refer to the next season. Or, you know, I've been grappling with this and trying to think of some ways that, you know, like the existing permits would have, you know, how long does it take a farmer to recover their investment? I mean, they've made a lot of investments to comply with the waterborne requirements, upgrade their roads, do all these things, right? I mean, it's a lot of money that people have put out there. It's not just that one crop. They've made a lot of improvements to their property to come into compliance that they're expecting to amortize over a number of years. And so I was thinking about whether there was a way to, you know, provide some sort of assurance that they'd have a minimum window if they were doing everything right, except odor. You know, so I don't have an answer for that one right now, but I think we do definitely need to exclude the current harvest. The other thing I think we should put in is that it does not apply to ag zone parcels. And we've discussed, the Planning Commission has discussed multiple times that odors from operations on ag zone parcels are not subject to mitigation requirements because it's an ag zone parcel that people expect that there could be agricultural type odors resulting from. Well, I think at a minimum we need to include that to make sure that, I mean, there aren't that many ag parcels, but there's some, and I think we need to.
I agree with that.
But if anyone has any other thoughts on how we could try to find some middle ground between the farmers' investments and the nuisance, potential nuisance for neighbors, I'd like to discuss it and think about it.
Yeah, it seems like on ag zoning, you can have a hog farm or raise beef cattle. That I fully agree with your statement with regards to the smell of an agricultural crop in ag zoning.
I also agree.
So without looking to jump in out of place or cut off any other commissioner comments, I think maybe this is a good point to bring up what to do about this, and not maybe even this issue specifically, because in my opinion this is good discussion. But the choice in front of us becomes, you know, how can we modify, say, that one sentence there, in that third bullet or that third sub-bullet point. We could work on an exercise of trying to modify that language, or we could work on taking good notes and double checking that we're understanding what your intent is, should you even decide to say vote on this idea, or so that it's clear for staff that we know what your recommendation really is. And then going through the delegation authority for approving that particular mitigation through the chair. So as long as it's clear to staff what you're requesting and what it is you would like to recommend to the board, we'd be happy with that. But I still think we need to choose kind of a process for how to proceed, given any particular discussion along these lines.
Well, I'd propose that that last mitigation of eradication just be removed, or recommended that the Board of Supervisors remove that statement as a mitigation.
And also that all odor mitigations be removed for rows on agricultural land.
Again, sorry to interrupt, but that's to my point. So understand, say, if you're wanting to discuss the simple elimination of that entire paragraph, those two sentences, okay, I understand, but it's the idea of adding more language. and where and how to add that, that then becomes something that's a little trickier for staff to do right now, of course. And so that's where the idea of making the commission's will known as a body, as you choose to. But I guess I'm advocating for giving staff some leeway to be able to understand where to put that in, if that's what you're wishing to do. And that's difficult for us to do right here, say on the fly. So there's two things. One is striking language, that's relatively straightforward, but adding language becomes a different matter.
And so the adding language, what you're proposing, if we add language such as odor mitigations need not apply on cultivations that are on ag-zoned land, would be okayed by the chair? Is that what you are recommending? Once the language is written?
I'm having a hard time finding that particular mitigation. You said 3.33.
On page ES10.
Yes.
There you go, thank you. ES10,
Bottom of the estimate.
executive summary, page 10, ES-10.
Thank you.
And that is volume 2 of the final EIR.
If I may jump in while we're looking at this, what I would suggest is that the commission think the idea that it wants to communicate to the board. So as David mentioned, telling the board that we want to strike language, that's a pretty simple concept. I think what we need from the commission, if it wants to make a recommendation on this particular mitigation measure or any others, is just the idea that you want to communicate to the board. As far as how we draft something and put it into ultimately the ordinance or the mitigation measures, that's something that we can work on between now and the board meeting with some precise legal language. But really, I think we just need the concept to be communicated so we know what to recommend, and then we can prepare appropriate legally drafted language for the board to consider if it wishes to implement the commission's direction or recommendation.
Okay, so do we need to make a motion regarding this?
Well, what I would suggest is if there's consensus on the item, then that you can simply give us direction and then we can add that to this Exhibit A. Or you can give us direction on how you want that exhibit or that attachment A to read. And then once we've worked through all of that, then we can have the board or the commission take a final vote on the resolution. So for now, I think you should just go through the items that you want to include in this attachment A. If you have consensus, there's no need to take a vote. We'll simply put that in there. I think if you do have some disagreements, then that might be a situation where we want to vote as to whether you're going to add that into that attachment A or not.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we have 3 people that, now, I believe that we have 3 people that agree that the odor mitigations should not apply to grows on ag zone land, and that the last bullet point regarding early harvest of plants is not appropriate. Is that correct? That we have 3 people that feel that way?
I concur with that.
I think that's correct. I do have some language here to simplify that last bullet if we want to consider actual language. So basically, I've kept the first sentence: corrective actions to address county verified off-site odor complaints will be identified, and then we strike out the first part of the next sentence, and replace it with an "and methods developed to be applied as part of the next harvest to minimize the impact." So basically eliminates the immediate and complete harvest of cannabis plants for the current harvest. And requires some sort of plan to be developed that mitigates it for the next harvest. And I think that's a reasonable compromise.
Yeah, it needs to be addressed. They need to not be a nuisance to the neighbors, but having time to address that. I agree with that.
I do as well.
Was that language clear enough to staff?
Sorry, just looking for the right colored pen. We took notes on that, yes, and I'll ask Senior Planner DeRose if you're comfortable.
Yes.
If he or she is comfortable. Is that the entirety of the language changes?
Well, then there'd be this other following sentence, so something to the effect that odor mitigations do not apply on licensed parcels with ag zoning. Just keep it as simple as possible.
That's where we cross the line, I think, is what Derek said.
What?
Inserting that language. We can state that that's the intent,
Oh, okay.
but they get to figure out where to put that in the document. I think that's what Derek said.
Well, I think he was okay with us providing language if.
For them to figure out. He said it was.
It's a recommendation, yeah, I mean,
Well, Derek,
it's
we
a
can ask you again,
recommendation in attachment A,
I think what Derek said was, we can strike language that's easy. If we want to add language, that's hard, and they won't figure out where to put it, but they can take note of our intent. That's what I heard.
Okay.
Along those lines, I was just having a sidebar here just for the moment of, yes, other places you could put that language, but that's exactly the kind of discussion I'd like staff not to have to get into right at the moment. Because it becomes confusing, it becomes complicated, there's a potential for errors that may run afoul perhaps of, in the opinion of Mr. Coles in the future. So it's something that staff with our consultant really need to debate, honestly, to make sure it passes muster, that it can be appropriate to add it. Yes, but where to add it, how to add it, how to frame that language. So again, striking, that makes sense. We have a notation of that. The added language, we have a notation of that. So it becomes, the suggestion of staff is that in order to proceed, say, to other items, given that there is a consensus here among the commissioners that this is what you want to do, the suggestion from staff is that we leave those notes as dictated, that we would then draft the attachment A, we'd redraft that and have that available specifically for the chair to review and to sign. I'm saying that because that allows us to proceed tonight to an actual resolution. Because if we don't proceed to the resolution, then we're looking at different timeframes for the entire project. So if there's a consensus among the commissioners to proceed to the resolution, staff is more than willing to have that language included in attachment A and presented to the board. But my concern is then, you know, if you want to see that language right now, that's very difficult for us to do.
I don't think anyone on the board wants to delay things, and so just so long as you have the idea that we do not want, that at least 3 of us do not want odor to an ag zone land. You can put that wherever you want, you can word it however you want, but that is, the majority of us want that in there, someplace. And you can put it in and the chair can sign it, and that's fine, as far as I'm concerned.
Just for clarity, it is the adding of words that would be signed by the chair, but anything stricken would be ratified this evening.
The whole thing is ratified. My suggestion is that any change you wish to make I would hope that there is a consensus, that it's as clear to staff as possible, whatever is stricken, whatever is added, so that there's agreement, that staff understands. But then Chair McHugh could review all of those changes, the stricken language as well as the added language. Oh, sorry, Chair. Apologies. I was even looking right at you. So.
It's all right. Yeah, I think we're beginning to reach an understanding there. Where basically, if we vote on this, pass or fail, either way, if you'll bring back this Exhibit A, and it would be my job to make sure that everything was included that we've discussed tonight, and then my signature would be enough to say that, yes, you guys got it right.
That is what I'm asking for, yes. And if I could get Mr. Cole to verify that that is in line with your thinking. I believe you already did, but please re-verify.
Yes. And again, the idea is that really to implement new language, we want to be precise. And so if we have the idea, we will very clearly communicate that to the board, and then we can develop the precise language that would be needed to implement your recommendations as a commission.
Thank you. Okay, so beyond odor mitigations, do we have any other concerns or comments from board and commissioners?
Well, we had touched upon groundwater, and I have some questions regarding the feasibility and reasonableness of it, and mitigation 3.10-2, and let's see, it says the county groundwater monitoring data for existing on-site well facilities documented well production and changes in groundwater levels during each month of the year. So I've done this with my own property. Once when I bought the property, I got a production test with Storkman Plumbing, and it took them 4 hours, and that's $85 an hour for them to run it at full capacity. And is that what we're talking about? Is just, a production test every month for the well? You run it for 4 hours at full capacity, see what it produces, see if the levels, if it loses its capacity. Is that what you're talking about?
That is one specific method, correct. And then you see what the recharge rate essentially is. But I'd like Mr. Angel to speak to that, please.
Yeah. The intent is not to run a pump test. The intent of this is to simply monitor what the groundwater levels are doing. And there are pretty common groundwater elevation meter tools out there in the marketplace that was mentioned earlier by David. Now, this is not intended to do a monthly pump test. It's just simply you've got a monitoring tool in there, so you're just recording each month what your groundwater water levels are. So we start to get an understanding of the groundwater basin, of the groundwater conditions are doing. I'm sorry, not the basin, just the groundwater conditions.
So what's the difference between a pump test and a production test?
Production and pump test, I use those in the same term. Typically, production, pump test, I'm using those terms at the same time. Those are commonly things that an agency will do for you to verify that you have a viable well. You pump it, for, as you mentioned, for a period of time, and then you see how the water levels recover, and you get rate of production of the well as a result of that. And I'm paraphrasing the process, but that's basically the process. Whereas you simply have a feature in the well that's just monitoring what the groundwater levels are doing on a monthly basis, so you get a sense of seasonality, how the groundwater elevations change based on conditions in the year.
Oh, thank you for that clarity, because it specifically says well production test once a month.
Well, I think there's some confusion. I think that's intended to apply to, you have to document that you produce, what, 1.5 gallons,
Okay.
right?
3 gallons. is
Three,
my-
3 gallons a minute, okay. So you have to document that, but I don't think that's supposed to also apply to the monthly stuff. Maybe Mr. Angel could address that, because otherwise it would sound like you have to do a production test
Yeah,
monthly.
yeah, it's intended to be, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you're correct, you were correct, that, yeah, there's the initial production test that's done, and then it's just annual monitoring. So certainly, if you wish, this is language that should be clarified. If it's causing confusion with the commission, it means there's potential confusion in regards to its implementation. So clarification is certainly an appropriate item for the commission to recommend.
Yeah, I need some clarification, so I'm still confused because it says production and changes in groundwater during each month of the year. It seems like that's pretty clear what they want.
Yes, okay, so okay, that's a fair point, that if it does become confusing perhaps, and I'm happy to revisit this one. So there are many different state approaches to how you're dealing with well productivity, let alone just getting a pump installed to begin with, and the idea of a production test being conducted at the time that any particular well is actually drilled. So Storkman can come out, or anyone can, the well driller, whoever they might be, can come out and actually run a well production test to understand, say in that situation, if your well is producing well enough for whatever purposes you need it for. For cannabis purposes, the county has a policy that is 3 gallons per minute, and anything below that is deemed to be unviable for whatever size grow or operation that you have. That is also something that can be addressed in the future at a different time. So aside from drilling a well, have a well production test so you know what you're dealing with. This mitigation is understanding, as many comments have come in from the public regarding groundwater impacts and concerns, this is an attempt to address those. And in order to do that, this mitigation, as I understand it, is that you're doing two things. One is that you're looking at the groundwater level within the well itself, so that is being monitored. That data that is provided every month shows whether that level is being reduced during different months of the growing season. So you can understand how that water recharge within the well is actually responding to the demand. The demand of the grow, but also if you're in a drought, the hydrology or whatever it might be, how that well is producing based on just the water level. It is also asking that you're looking at water productivity in terms of water use. How much water are you actually drawing out of that well? For this has to be specifically for cannabis uses, but how much water are you actually using? So what that could functionally look like, in my interpretation of how this could be applied to the program or to an individual site, is that if the county is receiving those two data points of water level and water usage, then we could compare those over time and over years to understand that if you have a productive well in the spring, it's reducing its productivity in the summer to the point where you're not drawing from it anymore, or not much anyway. We see those numbers dip to a degree that it shows a pattern of that well may not actually be keeping up in the height of the growing season. Then it's something that this county needs to have the ability to look at. Is that well producing when it needs to be producing? And so having that data means that, yes, the county needs to be able to interpret that data, but more importantly, it's over time. It may be over a number of months or a number of years until you can actually create a picture of how that groundwater, how that well is fitting within the landscape. That is the intent, because if you then begin to notice a pattern where that well may not be producing well enough, well, then there needs to be an adaptive management plan that's put into place to address that concern. That is what this mitigation is saying, irrespective of any sort of surface water connectivity issues, which it also mentions is addressed by other agencies. So that's how I would best describe it, I think. Is there's some way to monitor what's going on, and it puts the responsibility on the county to be able to work with the grower to have an adaptive plan to fix any potential issues that are identified. And again, there's many other ways to do it, but this is one that we had settled on.
Do you think there's any way you can clean up that language to make it more make it easier to understand that what you're asking for is water level monitoring and water usage monitoring instead of saying a production test. Have it water level monitoring rather than production test or whatever. I don't know how you would clean up that language, but if you could make it a little clearer, so in the future we don't have new county official that's wanting a pump test once a month, that would be crazy.
A pumping test versus a pump test versus a well productivity issue, yes, so, can I ask Mr. Angel, can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I think I think what's being requested is fine, that the clarification, the intent is to monitor what the groundwater levels are doing as well as operating during the year. So it's just a recording of what the groundwater level is in each given month, not a production test, not a pump test. So what's the static groundwater condition in each month of the year? That's the intent of this.
But you also need the usage. You need a meter to be able to tell you how much water the well produced and what the.
Yeah, also we want to know how much water is being used, so there should be a meter as part of the pump.
Which that's a mitigation that the water board mandates already.
Correct.
Commissioner Stewart.
Commissioner Stewart.
Thank you. I had somebody call me about this very mitigation a couple of days ago, and they were very concerned because according to what they understood from the language on this, they would require somebody from out of the area, because there was nobody locally that could do it, that would run some kind of a test that would cost them $3,000 every month to do. And so I absolutely agree that this language needs to be clarified so people know exactly what's being required. And it's not some esoteric, very expensive thing that's done only by a limited number of professionals.
If I could jump in there, yes, I agree with that. I understand where we're going now is to maybe for language clarification. My understanding of this was that it was not a pump test that, say, during August, a dry year in a drought, that you're required to pump your own well down to its capacity, see how long it takes for it to recharge, and basically put all of that water on the ground and think that that's a good idea. No, that was not where we were trying to go with this. And understand that you would absolutely have to do that every well for every month. So, no, that is not this intent. I understand the confusion. If I could hear some potential language change, perhaps Commissioner Matthews would have provide some clarity on that to get to a consensus.
Well, I just changed well production to water usage via metering and changes in groundwater levels. And it sort of makes it more clear, I guess. It's really just, I mean, you could definitely interpret well production to mean, the volume of water that the well produces, but you can also interpret it to mean some sort of production testing, which is what we don't want it to refer to. So.
I think usage would bring clarity to that. Just striking production and put usage in its place would clarify the intent of that. And a question about groundwater level. Could you communicate to me what type of technology is available? Is it something that would need to be tested monthly? Or is there a probe that you can put in your well that tells what the depth is at any point in time?
again, perhaps Commissioner Matthews could speak to this too, but there are, I think, several technologies. Some would include, say, a laser, essentially, that is mounted on the well head that actually is giving some refraction that is showing the actual depth, or let's say the distance from the top of the well to the water level at any particular time. And that is one example of a method to do it. You can also drop a rock down there. This was a joke that we had at one point, but not seriously, of course. But it's there are technologies that are available that are designed to do that. And so if Commissioner Matthews could fill that in, I would appreciate it, or perhaps Mr. Angel.
Most well caps have a 3/4 inch threaded plug, and that's intended to be removed and then a well probe inserted, which is basically an electric current with a weight on the end. You lower it down, and then you have some sort of indicator that tells you when it hits the water level, and then you measure the the ones you buy commercially are marked off every 5 feet, and then every 50 feet they have. I've got a couple of them that I've used over the years. So it's a pretty simple thing. It might be a couple $100 to get a well probe. You can also make one if you're handy at all with. It's very simple. It's a battery with a wire, and then it's got to have something that.
And so would that take like a certified plumber or a cannabis inspector to come out on a monthly basis, or is that based on just the written-in statement from the farmer? How would that be implemented?
I don't want to, thank you, Commissioner Matthews. I don't want to go too far, honestly, into that type of detail, because that's beyond our ability to do at the moment. So understanding that with any applicant that has inspection requirements, any applicant that has essentially affidavits that are signed verifying that the information they are providing is correct, I could see that as one mechanism, as well as others. So I can't go into detail on that. That would be a component of the transition plan, which we can't get to until we pass the commission and the board itself.
I'm just trying to understand the feasibility of such a mitigation.
That's fair. I appreciate that. In terms of the feasibility for any particular cannabis operator, I would say that it is relatively easy to do. You had mentioned metering is already a component of other agency requirements. The idea of groundwater level is one where we feel it's reasonable and appropriate for an individual to be able to perform on their own. For an agricultural practice and a commercial one in that regard, I would consider that to be feasible. Understand again that we received not only did we identify this as an impact, but we received numerous public comments regarding this particular issue, and so it's one that I feel needs to directly be addressed, as we're attempting to do here. It's like any mitigation, and this is something you all know, but yes, some of them do require more labor or outlay in terms of resources, technology, something, in order to actually abide by the mitigation, yet that is still appropriate for an environmental review to call out.
I guess then again, this is Pat from Ascent. Just to add on again, the intent of this is its information to be provided as part of the licensing renewal process. So annually, basically, a cannabis cultivator as a well is recording his monitoring data, and then when it's time to renew his license, he submits that data as part of his license renewal. And so that data then comes into the county. So it's not every month they need to make a submittal. The intent is when you renew your license, you provide your annual report, and that process just continues while you have an active license. Obviously, if they're not cultivating 1 year or they suspended their license, they wouldn't need to do this.
Thanks for the clarity.
Commissioner McHugh, you've been unnaturally quiet. Do you have anything to add to this?
It's actually a natural state. From time to time. No, I'm listening to the conversation. I understand the concern about it, and I think the adjustments to the mitigation are appropriate.
So before we leave that issue, if I might ask Planner DeRose if the notes that were taken are sufficient and if that is the consensus of the commission?
Yeah, it seems like the consensus of the commission is just to clarify the language so that it's easier to understand that we're not, the requirement is not a volume test, a pump test, but just monitoring.
Understood. So with the language that Commissioner Matthews, apologies.
I got all the rules.
The Commissioner Matthews provided, then that is sufficient.
I believe so, yes.
I can tell you that when I started my career in hydrology, well probes, these electric well probes were, they were just becoming available. And prior to that, you'd use a steel tape with a weight on the end, and you'd put chalk along it, and you'd lower it down there. You had to know sort of roughly where the water level was, and then you basically see where the water, erased the chalk, and you pull back up and measure it, and so that's a very simple way to do it. But you don't have to buy it, very low tech, but it works.
All right, do we have any other mitigations anyone would like to visit?
Well, it seems like we ought to at least discuss the two comments that we received. One is on air quality, and the other is on the biological for the northern spotted owl. And I guess, the air quality one, these are comments we received before, and they basically say, the assumptions are inappropriate, it's not significant and unavoidable impact because everything's too conservative. Should we change anything, or does, is that having a very conservative analysis in the document, does that open us up for any kind of, to open up the county for litigation about air quality impacts? And when they're really, according to this, there's like 2 days in a year that it didn't attain PM 2.5 or whatever, so it's a very rare, and that was in the winter, that's from wood smoke, not from during the harvest season. So, should we be concerned about it? I'm just bringing this up. I don't know whether having a overly conservative statement analysis in the document puts us at any risk.
If I could speak to that briefly. Two points to make. One is that we have appreciated all of the comments that we have received and have cataloged those and kept those in our file and do read through them and do interpret them. Does it leave us at a risk? I would argue no, but I can also leave that to a discussion with Mr. Angel or Mr. Cole. To one specific point, and this is something I believe that Commissioner Matthews, you had made a comment during this last meeting on November 19th. I just want to make note that the assumptions within the document have changed, and those are based off of a questionnaire that county staff made the effort to put together and to put out to all licensed growers, regardless of their status in the program, honestly, to try to elicit better local data about particular issues, and some of them could speak to this particular issue. That included employment, for example, and the number of permanent versus seasonal employees. So between the draft, where there was a lot of debate about the assumptions that went into this analysis, between that draft and the final, we did make that effort to refine our assumptions and modify the numbers based off of data that was received from those questionnaires. Which I want to also point out is that we received a better response rate than many other counties that have done similar type questionnaires of cannabis participants, cannabis program participants specifically. So we made that effort, and we did revise our assumptions. Those revisions are noted in the final EIR Volume 2, and that questionnaire, that process was referenced as well in Volume 1, I believe. So I just wanted to make that note. And when the comment is made that the assumptions are too conservative or overly conservative, then with respect, I hear that, but I think that the public and you as well should, the commission as well should understand that we did make an effort to try to refine those, and that we feel that we are in a good position regarding both the assumptions that exist in the final EIR as well as the analysis that came from those. I point that out because that is in reference to this particular letter. That being said, if Mr. Angel or Mr. Cole have anything to add, I'd appreciate it.
I guess the only other thing I'd add that this comment letter talks about, it talks about concerns about particulate matter and using data from a monitoring station in Eureka. The important thing to realize with particulate matter, it's a basin-wide emission source. So it's not a localized issue, it's a basin-wide issue. So data from Eureka was rather substantial, and that's why we used it. They noted a one-year source from the Weaverville Courthouse as a data source. But again, it's a regional source, and not to make a how can I put this? To give you an example, which is an unfortunate example, during fire season, obviously smoke travels a rather far distance. That, in a sense, is a particulate, to give you some sense of how far a particulate issue can go. So just because in one spot, in one area of the basin isn't having an issue, doesn't mean the entire basin isn't being impacted by it.
Answer your question.
If staff's comfortable, or is everyone else, our commissioners comfortable with the air quality analysis? And I think we need to be somewhat responsive if we see something that looks concerning. I agree the numbers did change between the draft and the final, but they didn't change very much. And I think the assumptions are still highly conservative, as I mentioned in our last meeting.
What page is this on?
3.3-14 in volume 2. It's the last paragraph, or the last couple of paragraphs. I mean, that's one of the types of impacts, right? There's construction, and then there's employee vehicle trips that generate emissions. There's really two significant sources. But I'm completely willing to drop it if staff's comfortable and everyone else is comfortable. It's just
I mean, the numbers seem very conservative for construction for an agricultural site. Being seven months of construction, and I guess it depends on if they're building steel buildings and greenhouses, or they're just building planter boxes. In 22 weeks of heavy-duty equipment,
that's the number that really got my attention.
You know, I mean, one day with a dozer or is a lot of work. In my experience up here, I've never seen any operation, cannabis operation, where there's 22 weeks of off-road equipment. I mean, that's backhoes, dozers, graders, excavators, that type of equipment. I have never seen it, a fraction of that. I mean, there's, yeah. But as a result, are there, apologize for my non-understanding of that, are there mitigations based on these 22 weeks of impacts? And if there are, could you point those to me?
Well, there are the requirements that the equipment meets the Air Quality Control Board Tier 4, if available, Tier 3, uses biodiesel, alternative fuels. But again, as we talked about at the last meeting, it's if they're locally available, right? And so there's a way out, I guess, for most of the mitigations regarding
Right.
at least construction equipment.
Yeah.
So to point out as well, if I could, 3.3 air quality, that factor, that environmental factor, and those listed impacts that we're discussing now, those are all listed as significant and unavoidable after mitigation, which means, again, same with the odor conversation that we had earlier, is that where, say, for emissions, talking about the nature of needing to switch to a different fuel source. We did try to add language and understanding that the availability of that is a factor, as we discussed during this last meeting. So we need to provide a mitigation if it's understood to be a significant and unavoidable. Those mitigations are written as you see them in front of you. If the debate becomes, and with due respect to the commenter, absolutely, if the debate becomes now at this point, whether the assumptions in the analysis, such as you mentioned in terms of weeks of construction activity, are appropriate or inappropriate, then that, I would argue, is not the place or the time, because this has been there for this document has been out for some time. So it's a good discussion, but understand the ramifications of the discussion. And that is one where if you get to a resolution that recommends not certifying the EIR, that is an option, absolutely. But if it becomes one of challenging, say now in this forum, that analysis itself, then that is an issue for recirculation of the document. And so we looked at reasonably foreseeable expansion of the operations that could be in play in this county. And so yes, there were some assumptions made about the types of operations that would be in play, and construction would be required for the modification of the type of operation, such as building greenhouses, I'm suggesting. Did I hear? No? Okay.
As long as there's a way, an alternative, a way out to not have to use it if it's not available, it doesn't really matter how conservative these numbers are. I mean, but on the record, we're talking about a quarter-acre farm or a 1 acre farm. 22 weeks of heavy equipment for working on a quarter acre. And this is like, you know, is putting this in here. This is not an externality. This is what a conservative estimate of what is likely to happen. That boggles my mind. I can't imagine a project that would take 22 weeks of heavy-duty off-road equipment on a quarter acre. But I'm not a construction worker, so maybe I'm ignorant to that.
Well, part of it's also all the road work that you'll have to do and all that stuff. There could be some substantial construction involved, but I do understand that seems a little wild, but that's not, we can't change that at this point.
Okay.
Do we have any other concerns?
Oh, I just, we got this letter about the NSO, Northern Spotted Owl, and I just wanted staff to, or the consultant to, I don't know, address their primary concern, I guess. It says, in summary, I believe the mitigation measure requiring 2 years of NSO surveys of a 1.3 mile buffer for any cannabis site expansion is a one-size-fits-all approach that will likely prevent most sites from any expansion whatsoever, even when further mitigations and a site-specific habitat analysis could likely prevent significant impacts to NSO, roosting, nesting, or foraging. So, is it a one-size-fits-all approach?
This was kind of addressed in our staff report, where it is a one-size-fits-all approach because cannabis is not federally recognized, so they cannot get an incidental take permit for a federally endangered species, so they have to stay outside of the zone. So,
This isn't my area of knowledge. I just read the memo we got this evening and thought, oh, that's interesting conclusion there. So I just wanted to bring it up and see if there was any appropriate discussion.
I'm glad you did, absolutely, because of course it was discussed during this last meeting, and appropriately so, and so we wanted to reiterate what we had mentioned in the staff report, that essentially for the program's sake, because it's not federally legal in terms of the agricultural product, that there's not a lot of leeway here. And that's unfortunate, but that's the reality of any listed species, such as northern spotted owl. I do want to point out that the comment letter is well written and well received. Regardless, we don't feel we can really modify or change the mitigation itself, but I do appreciate that the commenter pointed out the idea of a collaborative effort. So the one size fits all is kind of required because it's a program level document, for one, that does not address the situation of any particular site, any particular cannabis site, whether it's actually in spotted owl critical habitat or not, because it can't. It can just point out that critical habitat does exist in the county and that it argues needs to be respected. Again, because it's a federal issue. So I like the idea that if anybody who is either building a new site, excuse me, building a new site or seeking to expand their designated area needs to consider this, because there's honestly no way for them not to. But to be able to do it collaboratively with other research efforts out of other individuals, say from Colorado, or any other local effort around spotted owl research and identification of habitat and real critical habitat, that I appreciate that idea and that approach of being able to actually get the data that you need to build an argument to the county that you do not need to worry about this mitigation, and then provide that to us, and that would be part of our checks and balances in the Appendix C environmental review. However, if you are in spotted owl habitat, it does mention that there are methods, including light shielding, including noise, which is actually in another mitigation as well, that is intended to reduce the impacts to that particular species. So again, we appreciate the letter. I feel that there's not a lot of room for us to move on it, but that it is well received with some good ideas.
Yeah, it mentioned respecting the habitat of these endangered species, but there are people that have done they can have less than 3/4 acre conversions, 3 acre conversions in habitat where spot owl exists. And so there's no distinction between if somebody's expanding their cultivation area within that 3 acre conversion of land that was the trees were already removed, versus removing trees from the forest. There's no distinction. I mean, if the land has already been disturbed.
I think it actually says in the mitigation measure that if you are going to remove trees from critical habitat, that's when that mitigation would be triggered, where you would have to have the full 2-year owl survey. I think it is when you're going to remove trees. So if you already had the open ground, if it was already cleared, I don't think then it would be an issue.
Correct.
Is that correct? So you can expand, for clarity, within your 3 acre conversion
As long as-
without having to do the mitigations for the spotted owl.
That is my understanding, yes. That this is very specific to the idea of removing habitat and what is designated as critical habitat, or could be designated as critical habitat. So there's some caveats in here that I understand if you look at a map that it appears that it's quite a blanket. Spotted owl critical habitat is quite a blanket over the entire county that would remove any potential. No, I wouldn't claim that, because I think there are methods to work within this mitigation that are appropriate that may not require a specific protocol level as in that 2-year survey approach. Biologists or ornithologists could help people decide whether this mitigation is appropriate or not, and that's where the county feels that we need people to do that. We need them to address all of the species that are listed in that section, 3.4 biological resources, because we can't get away from it. So we need the help doing it. That is through consultants, that is through someone qualified to tell us that it's not a problem, or redesign your site so that it doesn't become a problem. But I don't consider this to be that much of an inhibition to the ability to move forward, especially if you can work collaboratively with other research groups that are helping make those determinations. I hope that was clear.
And is that something, working collaboratively, is that something that would need to be added to this in order for that mitigation to be accomplished, or is that just inherent?
In my opinion, for what it's worth at the moment, no, I would not suggest that that would need to be added or could even be added, because it would sound like you can work collaboratively or you cannot. I mean, it's there, but that would, again, be part of a future determination that could be guided by a transition plan for, say, how this specific mitigation or any of those in the biological resource section would be applied. Of course, we're looking for information, and we're looking for verification that the mitigations are applied. And so we understand there's many different people out there that can do that in many different ways. And for biological resources, if they meet the qualifications, then we're more than happy to work with those who meet those qualifications.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other areas of concern or motions?
I know Mike wants to talk about density.
It's not in there.
I do, but since it didn't make it into tonight's amended or updates to the FEIR, I'm a little disappointed in that, and I probably can't support this EIR. It's a conclusion I've got to reach. But I won't burden you with more on density at this point.
Is that the issue, the primary issue that prevents you from supporting it? I'm just sort of curious because we haven't heard from you.
I think that the cumulative impacts of this, as we've heard before this commission in recent meetings, are significant. And there are some mitigations that are actually in here. I would point to opt-outs as a way to mitigate. And I just don't think that was treated effectively. They're tough issues. Odor is a big one. It's a tough one. I think when we heard recent testimony about the next row coming on the block, putting, the straw in the camel's back, just too much. And not just odor, traffic, and a whole bit. it points to the density issue, and my term is density, you know, it's the cumulative impact of the number of grows in an area, whether it's a zoning district or a neighborhood or a watershed or any dimension of the intensity of usage of these activities, all the cannabis activities in an area. It's an issue, and I think the EIR punts on the issue, so. That, if that adds clarity to answer your question.
It helps me understand where you're coming from on it.
Okay.
Commissioner McHugh, could you speak into the mic that's on your right?
Oh, come on. Put two of them in here and then,
The one on the left. is
can I
on.
move this over here?
Yeah. We're getting complaints.
And please repeat everything that you
Yeah,
said.
so everything I just said. I apologize that the mic is letting me down here.
Well, I guess I'm disappointed to hear that we're not going to have a unanimous vote. But I will go ahead and make a motion to adopt Resolution 2020-13, recommending to the Board of Supervisors. The resolution certifies the Trinity County Commercial Cannabis Program Final EIR, includes the California Environmental Quality Act findings of fact and adopting the mitigation measures, and adopt an ordinance for Trinity County Cannabis Program as a combined ordinance incorporating the adopted mitigation measures. And the elements that we've discussed tonight and at the last meeting are in attachment A to the resolution. And that will be slightly modified for the chair's final approval. Does that convey that?
That seems adequate to me, yes, if Mr. Cole could speak to that, or perhaps Council Long.
We have a motion, do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Motion and a second, and this will be roll call vote.
I have another comment to make.
You are, you,
I've been trying to get, can anybody,
I think Commissioner Stewart's trying to say something.
we're having a hard time hearing you, Commissioner Stewart.
I've been trying to get people's attention for a few minutes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, there is one thing that I was hoping to discuss regarding the ordinance itself, and that is the fact that I think it could be really helpful if we made if anybody else agrees, if we made the suggestion to the Board of Supervisors that there be progressive penalties for licensed cultivators who make the same take the same illegal action over and over and over again. Just as an example,
We lost you again.
if they get cited, what? For instance, can you hear me now?
Yes, we've got you back again.
Okay, for instance, light escaping from a greenhouse. If light escapes from a greenhouse and a person gets cited for it once, and then they continue, and it continues, and it continues, that there should be progressive discipline up to and including termination or revocation of their license. And that's just one example, but for any particular action that they do that is against their license, that there be progressive discipline up to and including revocation of the license.
So if I may jump in, we can certainly convey that to the Board of Supervisors. I would say that the action tonight is about updating the ordinance to reflect the.
Okay.
And so I think that's maybe not the right topic for tonight, but that is absolutely a topic that the planning commission can make a recommendation to the board about. I think maybe tonight we should focus on adopting the mitigation measures that are in the EIR, but certainly staff can convey that sentiment to the board. But I think that might be something that's technically separate from what we're doing.
Okay, that's fine. It's just something I've been thinking about and wanted to, thought this might be a good time, but evidently not, and that's fine. So forget I said anything, we'll take it up later.
Okay, Commissioner McHugh, you were saying something and I couldn't understand you.
Well, in the spirit of what Commissioner Stewart is discussing, the ordinance that goes along with the EIR in this resolution, the baseline for the EIR was 2018 December, I believe. The ordinance that this is based on tonight is the February 2019 amendment, so it postdates the baseline. And we heard specifically that the stacking issue was not included in the EIR study. In fact, it's included in Chapter 2, which are things to be considered later. And yet, the ordinance as presented turns stacking on, or leaves it on, because it's in the 2019 ordinance. So I would also like to pass, and the board is discussing this, in fact, they're in the middle of a 30-day period to fix that. So this doesn't fix it, but I guess they'll have to turn around and fix it again after this, or whatever they do with this ordinance. But in the spirit of picking up changes that were done post-December 18, which was the baseline, there's also the Rush Creek opt-out area, which the board has passed, which I don't think actually has an environmental impact. What wasn't picked up in this draft either, and I would like to pass the message on to the board to look at those two things. This puts stacking, leave stacking in, although we've been told multiple times, specifically the EIR does not study stacking, and therefore it's not appropriate until it does. And secondly, that the Rush Creek thing, the board should look at putting that in when they pass this ordinance to save themselves another ordinance cycle to put it back in after the fact. So just my two comments on the ordinance we're about to recommend.
We can definitely convey that to the board, and for staff, it was a difficult call knowing the board. Let me get the microphone. Knowing the board was addressing the issue, but we were trying to get this done, so we definitely take that into account.
They can fix it though, when it gets to their level.
Okay.
That's all I had to say.
Okay, we still do have a motion and a second on the table. Do we have any competing motions or further discussion?
If I may interject at some point, whether now or at some point prior to the vote, if we can make sure that we have those notes taken as you wish them to be taken. If that's okay, is that reasonable?
How do we want to, do you want to read over your notes? Mm-hmm. Okay, well.
Good evening. Again, my name is Margie DeRose. I'm a senior planner with the Trinity County Cannabis Division. I just wanted to quickly go over the items that you would like to see modified as part of the resolution before you tonight. The first one is for mitigation 3.3-3 regarding odor control mitigations. The language that I have in here on the last sub-bullet on page ES10 of the mitigation measure table is to strike through the sentence, "This may include immediate and complete harvest of the cannabis plants." or identification of other methods to be applied as part of the current harvest or the next harvest, and replace that language with and methods to be developed and applied for the next harvest. And the sentence continues to minimize off-site odor impacts, so they would not conflict with other applicable standards of the county's cannabis program or state license requirements.
That's exactly what I said.
Great. The other item was to, that odor mitigations shall not apply to ag zone lands. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah.
Great. And the next change you'd like to see is under mitigation measure 3.10-2 regarding groundwater monitoring requirements. And this is on page ES 46 of the mitigation measure table. Under the first bullet, replace the word production with usage to read, as part of the application and license renewal process, applicants shall provide the county with groundwater monitoring data for existing on-site well facilities that documents well usage and changes in groundwater levels during each month of the year. I had a couple versions of edits to that. I just wanted to clarify if you wanted to replace the word production with usage, or if you wanted to change it to say water usage or changes in groundwater levels.
Well, there are two different mitigations there, right? There was production and then changes in groundwater.
Well, it's the same mitigation measure.
So you could,
Okay. Well, I mean, it was two, but you're looking at the same thing, but one is usage and the other one is level. And we didn't necessarily want to change the water level terminology, but the usage terminology.
The production to usage.
Production.
I think production to usage
It's the simplest.
is the simplest fix.
Yep.
okay, those were the two changes that I documented, or I guess three changes to the two mitigations that I identified. Is that accurate?
I believe so.
In my opinion, yes.
I would concur.
Great.
All right. Back to the business at hand. We have a motion, and
Do I need to amend my motion to reflect Commissioner McHugh's request that the board consider the stacking issue and the opt-out, Rush Creek opt-out issue?
I was just honestly debating that, and my read of it, and I'd be happy for advice, was that, no, the changes to the resolution are specific to the language just detailed to you. The request that items be brought up to the board, we also have notes on, and don't necessarily have to be part of the resolution itself. Unless, as Commissioner Stewart mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting, is that she does want that to be really drafted in the resolution. That is also something that we would follow the same path and get Chair Frazier's sign off on how those would be brought up. You can go either route, in my opinion.
I would like confirmation from county council on that.
Okay. County Council Long, are you available at the moment?
Yes, I am.
Hello, did you hear that question?
It was a little bit garbled, if you wouldn't mind repeating it.
The question becomes, there is a resolution in front of us, first and a second, that is modifying the attachment A with different language to go to the board for their consideration. That process, we took some notes on and have down a process down for that. Second part of the question is, there are a number of suggestions that the commission would like the board to hear, specifically related to the ordinance, opt-out, stacking, enforcement, or some subject heads. Do those suggestions for board consideration need to be included in the resolution, or can they stand alone as sort of staff direction?
We'll take the second part of the question first, and that is staff direction and does not need to be included in the resolution. I would make sure that you would read back the direction given from planning to go to the board so that we make sure we have a clear record of it, but it does not require to be included in the resolution. As to the first question, I still didn't quite understand the question. Is it if you have a maker of a motion and they amend it, or can you please repeat that part?
In terms of the rules of procedure, I think we are still online. We are in discussion for clarification of the existing motion and second.
Correct. From what I heard, we hadn't amended the motion. If, just for clarification, once the discussion happens, if the maker of the motion feels that substantively changes what their motion is, they can amend their motion, and the individual who seconded it just would have to amend their second as well. But if there's no substantive changes and it's just a discussion, that's not needed.
Does that answer your question, Commissioner Matthews? Is that?
Yeah, I don't see any substantive changes. I mean, it's really just direction from the commission to staff on how to present this to the board. I think we're fine from my perspective.
Agreed.
Do we have any further discussion? Be a roll call.
Okay, roll call.
Call the board.
Commissioner McIntosh.
Aye.
Commissioner Matthews.
Aye.
Commissioner McHugh.
No.
Commissioner Stewart.
Aye.
Commissioner Frazier.
No.
Thank you.
What was the result?
3-2.
Motion carries. And do we have any other? I gotta find my agenda. No further business, so
Next meeting is a week from today.
Correct.
Okay.
that will, are we going to be still meeting at 6 p.m. or will we be back to our normal 7 o'clock meeting time?
We would love to meet at 6 p.m. if the commission is open to that option.
Commissioners, any thoughts on that idea?
Okay. Is
So
that,
we're considered essential, so if the governor's direction about 15% of the hospital capacity in a region happens, he seemed to think that 4 of the 5 regions in the state would go into stay-at-home operation within early December, so that's not going to affect us, correct?
Well, we'll have to reassess that and consult with public health if that occurs, and we will let you know.
just make sure you're home by curfew tonight.
I'll make it.
It's him, I'm worried.
Unless I break speed laws. So, is everybody good with 6 p.m.?
Yeah.
I am.
I'm okay with that, but our standard practice has been 7 p.m. So if we start changing regular meeting times, we may have to make a broader deal out of that. I don't know if that's a policy change or something, but just posting on the agenda may or may not be adequate, I'm not sure.
We also note that, like we did online for this evening's meeting at 6 p.m. and we'll call that out and try to spread the word as much as
I think
we can.
as long as there's no legal and noticing issues involved, I'm fine with 6 o'clock. I
Yeah,
have to
I'm
make-
fine with 6 o'clock.
I have to come through the road construction at 2 anyway, so. Yeah, so 6 o'clock a week from tonight.
And if I could, before you adjourn, if that was your next step, a point of clarification, honestly, from something that I had said earlier, and that was delegating the role of the chair to sign off. That was a component of your.
Yes.
He did that.
Good, excellent. I just wanted, before we all left here, I wanted to double check, so thank you.
I think we are adjourned.
Thank you all.
Commissioner Stewart?
Come on, you.
Huh?
Oh, wait a minute, no, that was.
Love it.
Congratulations.
My favorite
So,
town.
well,
Really is.
Very nice.
You'll be seeing it more than 100.